much for being with us today. It is an absolute honour to be interviewing you, and we really thank you for finding the time. I know this has been a really busy schedule. You did manage to get to the Oval, but it has been a very busy schedule as well as that, so thank you very much for coming.
And it's my honour to be interviewed by you. That's such a pleasure to see you here. Didn't know about the shrapnel. I hope you managed to get it out.
It's fine. It's still in there.
It's still in there.
Yeah,
but you're able
that's
to walk
fine.
on
It's
it.
fine. It's
My
fine.
God.
I was very, very happy. Shashi, I wanted to ask you to talk to you first perhaps about something that you share with the Hope Foundation, which is your passion for education. And the Hope Foundation, as I'm sure you all know, really believes that education is the way that it can break the cycle of poverty for young people that the Hope Foundation looks after. And I know that you have been spoken out very vocally about education. India has got a huge amount of potential. What is it, something like 50% of the population are under 25, which is amazing,
right.
You know. So
51% and about 65% are 35, so it's huge.
And so, you know, these are figures that, you know, Japan, Europe, the US could only dream about, you know, in terms of what that is, the kind of potential, the capital there that you have to provide goods and services to the rest of the world. But of course, those young people need to be equipped, they need to be educated. Is that one of India's biggest challenges going forward, to work out how to educate?
Unquestionably, Andrea. In fact, I briefly served as Minister for Education for about a year and a half in the last Congress government, ending in 2014. And it was very clear to us that this was not just a human problem, that we had all this vast number of people who could see who was going to come, who was going to be born in the next 10 years, and we didn't have enough opportunities to educate them, train them, develop their skills. And this was, to me, a huge worry, because apart from the human and social economic aspects of it, it's also a national security issue, because there's nothing more dangerous for a society than large legions of unemployed young men. And there would be very many if we weren't able to get our act together. We diagnosed the problem, but we were unable to solve it when the elections were lost and we went into opposition. And I'm sorry to say we haven't seen a huge amount of progress since then. Basic literacy, yes. I think we introduced a Right to Education Act when we were in power that obliges the state to catch every child out of school and educate them. And so in the primary education level, we have a gross enrollment ratio. This, I don't know how many of you follow educational jargon, but the GER, the gross enrollment ratio, is the percentage within a particular age group of children in education. So the gross enrollment ratio in England, I'm sure, for primary school children is probably 100%. In India, for the last few years, it's been about 105%, because we've been able to catch some children who had missed out on schooling earlier and bring them into the primary school system. The problem is the dropout rate starts already after the 5th grade. By the 8th, we have a significant dropout. By the 10th, most of them are gone from the government school system. And we don't do enough.
Them as well, don't you? You give them
Yes, the government schools have a midday meal program. So when they come in, they absolutely are fed in the afternoon. In fact, what it was also meant to be an incentive to parents from poor families who are struggling to feed their children, that by sending them to school, they would not just get an education, they'd also get a meal. But all of that, nonetheless, didn't keep them there beyond a certain point, because of economic reality, as that first film said. Parents often feel the need to put their children out to work in the hope of some economic remuneration. And though child labor is illegal in India, it's a law that's broken every day in every place. And so that remains a problem. What I was going to say is we also need to catch them through skill development, vocational training. You have a very good tradition in this country of apprenticeships, not everybody is academically inclined and well and gifted, but to produce as many as you do of qualified masons and plumbers and electricians and carpenters is exactly what we need to do as well. For those who don't want to go and stick all the way through school and then college and get themselves a white-collar job, there's plenty of need for qualified people in the vocational field. We don't have that either. So both education and skill development are very important. One last thought, Andrea, on this is, it's so important. When I was at the United Nations, I used to get to address audiences a lot. One of the silly questions that often come my way is, so what's the one single thing we should be doing to the magic bullet for development? There isn't a magic bullet. But when I thought about it, instead of giving long rambling answers about how we've got to get so many different things right and there isn't any one thing we can do to develop the world, I stumbled across the answer, and the answer was a 2-word mantra: educate girls.
Yeah.
There's an enormous amount of data now. Lots of studies show that the single most useful thing you can actually do is to educate girls. Educated girls, number one, have the knowledge that will enable them to have some control over their lives, delay, for example, when their families press them into marriage, have the courage to stand up for their rights within the marriage, space out children, and when they have children, know about the basics of how to bring them up. For example, why you should boil water rather than feed them dirty water, illnesses, all that sort of thing, the importance of nourishment. And we found that in every country in the world, just having 5 years of basic education transformed the fortunes of entire societies. And if women were educated, I mean, the old cliche that many of you have heard before, that you educate a boy, you educate a person, you educate a girl, you educate a family, you transform a community. And that's also very important to do.
Now, I know that many people here tonight can sponsor children, and hopefully after this, many more will think about doing that. And the kids that are sponsored through Hope, often Hope is trying to address some of the issues that you're talking about. The reasons are very complex that children don't go to school, and you touched on this, things like maybe they have to look after younger children because parents are going to work, maybe elderly relatives. Again, families just not really understanding the importance of a child staying at work, staying in school, particularly girls, and also child labour. You said child labour is against the law in India, but that's broken every day. And I wonder, is there not more that can be done to prevent children being allowed to work? And therefore, that would mean that actually that avenue could be closed down. I mean, it does seem from the outside, and maybe this is a naive view, that is a bit of an easier fix, perhaps?
I remember almost 30 years ago, when Kofi Annan was Secretary General, he and I had a conversation on just this very subject with the then Prime Minister. It wasn't a very long-serving Prime Minister, Mr. Devagowda. He lasted about less than a year. But he said something which took both Kofi and me aback. He said, yes, it's illegal, but if we enforce the law, are we not denying a family the possibility of eating? If we take that child away from the loom where he's weaving something, or the sports factory where he's stitching a cricket ball or a football, or the fields where he might be working, and we force him into school, a very poor family loses a certain amount of income, which is what keeps the family fed and well. Until we can solve that problem, isn't it irresponsible of us, he said, to take them out of employment. Now, not everyone is that honest, and we were taken aback, and it was a private conversation, not a public speech. But it made me think for a minute that there was a point to be made. Yes, we could send policemen out, and in some areas, some places we did wherever we could, to force children into school. But at the end of the day, unless we can develop the entire society and make sure that the families are able, that the father has a job, if there is a father, and if there isn't, that the mother has a job, what do we do? So 20 years later, my party's government came up with something called the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, whereby every poor family in every village had the right to have at least one member receive 100 days of paid employment. And that has been a lifeline. It's actually saved many rural families from utter destitution. The scheme is now about 15 years old. It's grown in popularity with people, but therefore the funding onus on the government has also grown, and we are seeing, unfortunately, budget cutbacks now, so more and more people aren't getting a full 100 days of work. But it's very difficult to, on the one hand, tell people you can't make money by getting your children employed, and at the same time telling them, sorry, we don't have anything better for you, and there's no real social safety net. That's the challenge.
And indeed, that's a lot of the work that Hope does, is try to find ways to keep children in school by making sure that perhaps there is a system where a mother can work in a small cooperative,
That's
allowing the child to go to school.
That would be good, and the other thing we could do is also ensure we give them more than one meal a day. Maybe we could give them two. Maybe we could give them something before they go home in the evening, or in the afternoon.
Yeah.
In schools, feed them at schools and then send them.
You know, I mean, India is growing so quickly. You know, one of the fastest growing economies in the world. Huge amounts of wealth being created. We have issues in the UK, Ireland, and elsewhere with inequality, particularly in this cost of living crisis that we're going through at the moment. And obviously, there's huge inequality in India too. And I wonder if you feel that this fast-growing economy is lifting, it's a tide that lifts all boats, or are you worried that the kind of children that are helped by hope, but obviously hope can't help them all, end up getting more marginalised and more left behind in India?
No, because hope is equipping them with education, with opportunities, with good health and hospitals and so on.
I'm talking about all the others.
But the others do get left behind.
But do you think more so, or I mean, do you think that this
the economic growth
is going to help everybody?
Only up to a point. I mean, I know that there's passionate debates about does a rising tide lift all boats, or does trickle down really work? And I'm not going to waste anyone's time with a convoluted debate on that right now, because a little bit of both is true. Yes, sometimes if the general economy is prospering, then more jobs will be created, more services will be needed, more people will be employed. We currently have a slightly unusual situation in India, where we've hit the highest unemployment ever recorded since numbers began to be kept in the late 1930s. And that's very worrying. So you've got a kind of jobless growth, where the macro figures are very impressive, the infrastructure is booming, the high-tech work in India has taken off remarkably. And yet, you know, lots of unemployed young men and women are hanging around looking for work and not getting it. We now have high unemployment. We have the lowest labor force participation ever from women. Women are dropping out of the workforce. These things are worrying to me. And I'm not sure that we have figured out how to break the back of this particular problem. But in the meantime, if people aren't employed, then they will fall into destitution. We were very proud when my party was in power that over 10 years we put something like 230 million people above the poverty line. But in India it's been estimated that in the last 5 years about 100 million people have fallen below the poverty line who weren't below it earlier. And that's tough. As it is, our poverty line is not even the UN World Bank poverty line of whatever it is, $198 a day. It's lower than that. It's calculated in rupees, and it's a sum that's drawn barely this side of the funeral pyre. So you really need to equip people to be able to live decent lives. And that to me is the overriding preoccupation that we have. Of course economic growth can help. I mean, it's common sense that it grows, but it doesn't necessarily translate into everybody. I mean, if Mukesh Ambani walked into this room today, the average per capita income of all of us would go up brilliantly. But the moment he walked out, we'd be just as poor as we were before. So we can't look at those big numbers of GDP and per capita income and celebrate that alone. Because we have to see the genuine inequality, as you pointed out, the distribution of wealth, and how are people able to cope with their daily lives and their daily needs. You know, we have, for example, the government gave poor families a gas cylinder to cook with, because they were worried, rightly so, that women were cooking in windowless kitchens in their thatched huts and inhaling all these terrible fumes, and they were shortening their lives, they were breathing in carcinogens that were going to take their toll on their lungs and all of that stuff. But the problem was that they gave one gas cylinder, but then people had to buy their own refills and no one could afford a refill. And so there is, and especially in recent years as prices of gas and cooking gas too have gone up dramatically. So the result has been that very many of these poor families, they sort of continue cooking in those unsanitary conditions and saving the cooking gas cylinder for special occasions, which rather defeats the purpose of what's required. So the scale of the challenge, the resources required, far, far too big for anyone to offer glib solutions.
I wonder what you think of the role then of NGOs and charities. Because, I mean, I know you're a long and distinguished career at the UN, and I've come across the UN quite a lot in places like Afghanistan, Sierra Leone, Mozambique, in times of crisis. And things like the World Food Programme, UNHCR, absolute lifelines.
And we work with NGOs.
Yes, exactly. But those big programmes are often, there's a lot of bureaucracy, and sometimes it's a bit like turning an oil tanker. Whereas I've always been very impressed with Hope's ability to be working right in the grassroots and to change something quite quickly if they see a need. For example, in COVID, suddenly to go into relief work, or when they saw that that daughters of women who were working as sex workers were in danger of going into that trade too because of the area they were in, then those girls need to immediately be taken into an area of protection. They can work quite quickly. They know people on the ground. I mean, that's one of the things that impresses me about Hope, and I wondered if you could just share with us what impresses you about those charities and Hope in particular, and what role you feel they can have in India at the moment.
Well, first of all, I think Hope is doing wonderful work. I'm glad we saw those 2 little films. And I know that they were attracted idealists like the people we see here, who have faith in the genuineness of their sense of purpose and intent. I think that's the great thing about NGOs, is that usually they're doing this out of the kindness of their hearts. It's human beings, humanity to other human beings in need, which is very different from government action or even international organizations like the UN, which are full of staff by professionals with, as you said, cumbersome rules, regulations, audits and everything else, whereas NGOs can be far more nimble as well. The big question about NGOs, unlike big governmental programs, is, how many people can you help? I mean, any NGO is small enough. You choose one city or one kind of project or one sort of field to touch some lives, but the problem is so much vaster. And some people, I think wrongly, give up hope, saying it's too big a problem and this isn't making enough of a difference. My answer very simply is the famous line of Eleanor Roosevelt, when she was asked about this, and she said, better to light a candle than to curse the darkness. And I think that's really so important. You might not be able to bring light to the entire planet, but you can light up a little corner of it with your efforts. And I love that statement in the Jeremy Irons narrative, that they are giving, hope is giving hope, and that's ultimately the best thing human beings need. I can assure you that many of the beneficiaries of Hope will go on to fend for themselves. What you've given them is that leg up that they need. I've often said I've said in Parliament as well, that the magic of the market will not appeal to those who cannot afford to enter the marketplace. So if you're going to help people because you can't just wait for the marketplace to lift them up, then you need to give them a hand so they can enter that marketplace one day. Maybe not immediately, but you've got to equip them, you've got to help them rise above that. And then they want to help themselves. No human being really wants to subsist indefinitely on charity. But they need the charity just to be able to stand on their own feet. And I think if we think of it that way, what Hope is doing is so terribly important.
Shashi, I can't really have you in London without asking you a little bit about British-Indian relations.
Right.
And I think I'm Irish and I'm absolutely passionate and obsessed, probably, maybe too obsessed with history. I know that you have really worked on dissecting and understanding the complex history of India and indeed of its colonial past. Particularly in your book, which I know has been a big hit in our house and a big favourite over here, the Inglorious Empire, which has been, where you really looked at kind of contested history. However, I'm struck. I've got 3 children who have just gone through the whole of the British education system doing history to A level, and they learn a lot about France, a lot about English prime ministers, a lot about Hitler. That's all fine, but they learn very, very little about empire.
That's right.
Generally. And so I wonder, the kind of these areas that you talk about and that are contested. I would argue that a lot of people in the UK don't know anything about some of these areas. And I wonder what you think that does to Anglo-Indian relations today. Does it matter to the kind of relationship that India and Britain can have going forward, particularly as post-Brexit? I say England, but Britain is now looking at India, looking at this incredibly fast-growing economy and thinking, oh, a partnership there would be quite handy.
I'm going to surprise you and say it doesn't matter for
Yeah.
current contemporary Indo-British relations, because I believe history matters simply because we all need to, just as we want to know about our grandparents, we ought to know about our country's past. I mean, I think, you know, to be aware is fundamental for every sentient thinking individual.
Do you think there is, though? Is there a special relationship?
There is and there isn't. There is because obviously there's you know, much more, shall we say, consciousness of the British in India than there would be of any other
Yes.
country, largely because of your presence and what you left behind, culture, language, books, literature, all of that. I mean, many of you probably won't know this, but the study of English literature was invented in India. The British did not study English literature in Britain. They studied Latin and Greek and the classics and so on. But in order to overawe their colonial subjects in India, the subject English literature was invented for the first time to teach the Indians what a great civilization had come and conquered. I kid you not, as the Americans say, there are PhD theses on this. It's all documented. I'm not saying something controversial. And so all of that got left behind. Mind you, the premises were in many ways wrong. I mean, Macaulay notoriously said that a single shelf of English books is worth more than the entire learning of Arabia and India put together, which shows you the colossal ignorance as well as the effrontery with which this project was enabled. But nonetheless, all of this is there, and so there are common frames of reference.
Yeah.
And to my dismay and embarrassment, there are even some Anglophiles are sort of still going around, sort of relishing their annual vacations in London and speaking of them and watching the coronation and all of that, speaking of that with great reverence. And some of us are a little more politically opposed to all of that, but respect the value of the connection. Secondly, there is a Commonwealth connection. The Commonwealth may not be the most effective organization on the planet, but it does keep us together regularly. Third, there is the fact that in recent years in particular, both countries have become much more consciously aware of each other. The British diplomatic presence in India is active and visible. We've had Prince William come by. We've had a very active diaspora here, which is also a source of... one worry that some of us have is that perhaps the Indian diaspora might be slightly guilty of importing India's domestic divisions and problems into the British space, and certainly the Leicester riots were very sobering for all of us. I don't think anybody on any side of the subcontinent would like to see that recurring. Because in my own experience, I lived abroad for a very long time in the UN service for 29 years. In my experience, people from the subcontinent would forget their political divisions abroad. Indians and Pakistanis used to be very close friends everywhere, as long as they were not in India or in Pakistan. So the thing is that to see this kind of thing happening as occurred in Leicester was deeply distressing, and I hope that was good. Otherwise, there's some remarkable progress now on a possible free trade agreement. Yeah. It took a long time getting off the ground because Britain was a bit unrealistic in its approach. I mean, it knew what it wanted to sell India, but it wasn't particularly sure it wanted to take anything from India, and that obviously, you don't do a free trade agreement that's one-sided and unequal. And then there was this awful period, till about 2 years ago, where Indian students in the UK could only work for 2 weeks after they graduated, whereas Chinese could work for 2 years. And this was so iniquitous, it created a terribly negative. I mean, I'm afraid we owe that to the Cameron government, the Chinese thing, which the Indians didn't get. But that's been redressed now. Now the Indians and the Chinese can both stay for 2 years, which that's fine. Nothing against the Chinese. Well, we have a few things against the Chinese.
We probably don't have time for that.
Exactly. So all of these are good things. And though when I was here last year, I heard some unnecessarily optimistic talk about the free trade agreement being concluded by Diwali, and Diwali came and went, and that went down the tubes. Now I'm hearing much more positive talk that they really might be coming close to clinching a deal. So all of that should help. And if that happens, I think that will again cement the relationship. But you know, I don't know what Britain wants for itself. Do you remember Boris Johnson talking about London becoming Singapore on the Thames? Is that on the cards, Andrea?
That is not on the cards. I can tell you that Boris Johnson's vision of Singapore on the Thames was never going to be a realistic proposition, and I don't think that like possibly many things that Boris Johnson said, when we looked into it, there really wasn't very much there. So I don't think that that's anything that, it's certainly not what any of the government policies are, either this government or the opposition government. So I don't think that's what you're going to see. Shashi, I could talk to you all evening, but I don't want to stand between everybody and their main course. I also know that there are a lot of questions, so we are going to go and eat, and then we're going to come back, and then the microphones will go to you, and I will direct your questions to Shashi. So do think while you're eating. Thank you very much.